Hi, everyone. So this is John. So many of you probably know Sam Adams. Um, he's got a YouTube channel named Transfigured, and he identifies as a biblical Unitarian. And so he gave this lecture at the Unitarian Christian Alliance about basically some stuff about Christology, the nature of worship and Jesus, and the function of the Eucharist and that sort of thing. So, and I consider Sam a friend and a good dialogue, an honest dialogue partner. And so, I think the first time I sort of heard of this biblical Unitarian thing, I was kind of like, oh well, that's a little sounds a little weird. But the interesting thing, if you don't know Sam, he's basically an evangelical who, you could check all the boxes of a typical evangelical except for the Trinity and the capital D deity of Christ. So he's kind of in this interesting space that I think a lot of you sort of listening will be aware of this sort of uncanny valley of theology, especially amongst evangelicals, because they don't spend it, to spend a ton of time on, some of the more classical Christian doctrines or theologies. So, it's not like he's a Mormon or, even a JW, which, most evangelicals and, even most, non-evangelical, Orthodox Christians will see as well outside of the fold. He's sort of like almost there, but he's disagreeing with this one really fundamental aspect of theology. And this is the first time that I've ever when I sort of was exposed to Sam and eventually met him in person, this was the first time that I've been exposed to this particular strand of what biblical Unitarians. So it's kind of a really interesting thing to wrestle with and tackle in that sense, because it's not like you can just easily sort of they're just Sam is a Mormon or a whatever sort of sect sort of thing, because he's not. So and I think you'll see that as this comes out. So he asked me to do a response to this lecture that he gave about Christology, worship, and the Eucharist, basically. So I will try to share my screen here, and I don't know. My plan is to just go through this. I have a few notes written down, but it'll be pretty off the cuff. So I have it on 1.25 speed. So hopefully that's not too fast for everybody. I know in this podcast world, I'm always at 2 times speed for everything. So but here we go.
Consider him my spiritual mentor, who throughout my life has always been an example of delving into God's word and always seeking to learn more. And I would also thank my wife. She's not here, but she will hopefully listen to this at some point. I wouldn't have been able to do this without you. So thank you. So my presentation today is about Christology, worship, and the Eucharist. So how many of you have ever been asked, if you don't believe Jesus is God, how can you worship him? Wouldn't it be idolatry to worship Jesus if he isn't God? Doesn't the fact that we worship Jesus prove he's God? Isn't the worship of Jesus in the Bible proof that the Bible teaches Jesus is God? How many of you have ever been asked something like that? All right. And if you haven't been asked, how many of you wondered something about that? So that is the main question that this presentation will be addressing today. So I generally find 3 common Unitarian answers to this particular question. First answer could be, yes, Jesus is worshipped. Jesus is worshipped because he has been declared worthy of worship by God. A second possible answer would be, Jesus is kind of worshipped. He is worshipped in a way that you worship God the Father through Jesus. So Jesus is an intermediary such that worship given to Jesus goes to God. A third answer is Jesus is not worshipped. There's a distinction between worship given to the Father as God and the veneration given to Jesus as Lord.
I should just also add that this is sort of, his presentation is only 40 minutes, so there's only so much he can put in there, and he still manages to put quite a bit of I think interesting stuff in there, as we'll see. But I'm always tempted to as you'll see in the sort of points I bring up, I'm always tempted to sort of take this in a broader perspective and go sort of chase all these little, I think, rabbit trails that naturally arise out of this sort of discussion. So, when I do that, none of that is to say, oh, well, Sam should have addressed this because, he's up there for 40 minutes, a pretty restricted, inherently sort of restricted time frame. So, but I think the reason I will bring up the broader view of things is because, to me, I think, what he's going to talk about here, for me as a standard Trinitarian is going to be, let's say, not comprehensive enough for me to quite flip. So we'll get into that.
So there are actually scholars who support all three of these different positions even today. So it's not like this is settled even among the highest levels of academic scholarship. So this is a quote from Larry Hurtado. To demonstrate that Christ was given the sorts of devotion that we can properly understand as full cultic worship, and that we can rightly describe Christian worship of the earliest observable decades as genuinely binitarian. That is, I contend that at the surprisingly early stage, Christian worship had two recipients, God and Christ. Yet the early Christians understand themselves as monotheists and see their inclusion of Christ in their devotional life as in no way compromising the uniqueness of the one God to whom they had been converted through the gospel. Larry Hurtado recently passed away, but he's a very influential New Testament scholar, and he has made a lot of mileage, and a lot of Trinitarian apologists have made a lot of mileage out of his claim that the earliest Christians worship Jesus as God, and that will inevitably lead to something like the Trinity. A second position, so this is actually a quote from an interview that I did with Joshua Sijuwade on my YouTube channel. Joshua Sijuwade is a philosopher and a Catholic theologian, and he gave this answer when I asked him about this specific question. This cultic veneration of Jesus, this dyadic devotional pattern, which was there from the beginning, allowed there to be a high Christology. But I think the only way that if Hurtado is correct on these points, the only way that Paul and other first century Christians could have affirmed their view as monotheism and be worshiping the Son is because they had this idea that it was always directed to the one God through the Son.
So this is an interesting quote. And again, Sam has a podcast. Go listen to it. It's called Transfigured. I think I'll put a link to it in the description because super interesting. You'll learn a lot. I've learned a lot. So, anyways, I think what's interesting to me about this is there. I think we would both. Sam and I are both going to agree on some sort of pattern of mediation that Christ provides. I guess the devil's in the details, of course, of what exactly that source of mediation looks like. But just to sort of establish the agreement up front, that there is some sort of mediation between God the Father and humanity going on here. And I think, that's obvious to anyone who reads the Bible, one way or another, Unitarian or Trinitarian. And so just to have that point of unity and, how that mediation plays out is, again, we'll see.
Right. So he's giving basically answer 2, and he's a Catholic philosopher. All right. So, but James Dunn, another very influential Pauline scholar, he wrote a book, Did the First Christians Worship Jesus? He said this: the most consistent answer to the question, did the first Christians worship Jesus, was that Jesus was not usually worshipped as such. There was no thought of sacrifice being offered to Jesus, only of Jesus as the decisive sacrifice making right the relationship between God and believers. So who's right? I think severely lacking in this whole conversation is give a very clear, concise definition of worship before you start using that word. Look at Christian transformation of worship in the New Testament, look at other early sources about Christian worship practices, explain the ramifications of these findings regarding Christology, and then lastly, talk about the practical ramifications for us Unitarian Christians today.
And of course, all of this is, I totally agree with this approach. And, as we'll see, he'll make some important points that will still apply to, all Christians and not just, Unitarians.
So I want to talk about the distinction between worship and veneration. So I feel like the common modern Christian definition of worship is something like music and emotions from passionate singing, right? If you are in a church service and you hear the pastor say, we're about to enter a time of worship, what does that mean? It means that we're about to play some music, right? If you ask...
This side note, this is why, and he'll talk about the Eucharist, but this is why, my transformation from a low church to a high church, Protestant Christian, which maybe I'll discuss that more some other time, is making the Eucharist the center of worship, not how well we can play our electric guitar. So
what is a worship leader? Well, it looks like this, right? You have a handsome young man with a guitar and some skinny jeans. And I don't mean to be too critical. I've been a worship leader like this before, but I never really liked the skinny jeans. But if you ask, say, a Jew in Old Testament times, okay, who's your worship leader? Well, it would look like this. It's a high priest wearing the full priestly garments at an altar with an animal being sacrificed up to God. But apparently the hand position is actually still the same. All right, so I'm going to go into my first scriptural passage. This is from Matthew chapter 4. This is when Satan is tempting Jesus. And he, that is Satan, said to him, "All these things I will give you if you fall down and worship me." Then Jesus said to him, "Begone, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve." So looking at some of the Greek words in this passage, the word translated as worship here, and this is the ESV, but many translations use worship too. The Greek word or the root is proskuneo. And if you look at the word serve at the end, him only shall you serve, this is the word latreo. So proskuneo literally means to kiss towards. It's a physical gesture of submission, and it could be a bow or a kiss or something else. It depends a little bit on cultural context. My wife and I like watching Bollywood movies. They're a little bit cheesy, but that's kind of part of the point. If you watch Bollywood movies, or if you've been to India or similar cultures, they have a physical gesture where they will kiss their hand, bend down, and then touch the foot with that kissed hand of the person that they're paying respects to. And in a Indian wedding ceremony, the wife bends down, and shows submission to her husband, and there's lots of other circumstances where that happens. If you like a more Western example, if you want to ask the Godfather for a favor to help make an offer that can't be refused, you have to pay your respects to the Godfather, right? What do? You kiss his hand. That's what proskuneo literally means, a physical gesture showing submission and respect. Latreo is the word to offer service. And it is, I feel like a big problem is that the English word service just doesn't have the right oomph to it, right? Like your waiter serves you at a restaurant, a soldier serves his country. We use that in a lot of different ways, and it doesn't have quite the full biblical oomph when we translate with that word. The latreo means to perform a sacred service, to offer a gift of sacrifice to a god. Right. And it's related to service because it's sort of like a waiter gives food to you and you're giving an offering to God. So it's related to that word serve, but it very specifically means in a sacred sacrificial context, offering a gift to a god. Right. And so here's a picture. On the left is the Hindu elephant-headed god Ganesh. And so this is an idolatrous altar where you are giving the god bananas and red Fanta. And if you're going to give red Fanta to an elephant god, it helps to take off the top and stick a straw in, just so that he doesn't have to do that himself. Right, but the idea is that you're being nice to the god, right? You are serving the gods.
You think since he had a trunk, he could do that pretty easily. He wouldn't need a straw. But hey, I mean, the Hebrew prophets would have something to say about that.
Something, hopefully, that he wants, and then hopefully he'll do something nice to you, right? And in the Old Testament, it's, offering an animal on the altar as sacrifice to God according to the ways prescribed by God. That's what this word really means. So if you go back to Satan tempting Jesus, Satan is not asking Jesus for idolatrous religious worship. He is asking Jesus to kiss the hand, right? He's asking for physical submission to Satan's rule. He's not asking for idolatry. And Jesus responds, "You shall worship the Lord your God." You notice how this isn't exclusive. It doesn't say only worship the Lord your God. It says worship the Lord your God, right? It is proper to give a gesture of respect to God, but there are other people who could be appropriate to give that gesture too. But the last part, him only shall you serve, is exclusive. So the sacrificial worship is only given to God.
Okay, so this is I think the first spot where I'm going to have sort of a response. I mean, I can't say that I'll have like a exhaustive response to his line of reasoning, but I think it's it's more nuanced than sort of splitting between those words. So let's see if I can get my notes going here. So, in John 9, we have, this example of like this blind man proskuneoing, and just, side note, as you could already tell, I don't know Greek at all. I don't have any training in New Testament Greek. So I'll just be throwing on these words here extremely grammatically incorrectly. But I think so I brought up in John 9, let me just pull that up and read some of that. So this is the blind man who was, Jesus put mud on his eyes and healed his blindness, and then he goes into the synagogue, and one of the funniest moments in the New Testament, oh, do you Pharisees want to be his disciples too? I always laugh when I read that. So then we get to 9 verse 35. Jesus heard that they had thrown him out, so he found the man and said to him, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" The man replied, "And who is he, sir, that I may believe in him?" Jesus told him, you have seen him. He is the one speaking with you. He said, the blind man said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshipped him. So that worship is proskuneo, which is what Sam is talking about with, the sort of the kissing and the bowing too. The reason I bring this up is because I think this is definitely the most explicit case of where you see, I think, proskuneo being used with respect towards Jesus, that, as far as I'm aware, in the New Testament. So, well, and in the Old Testament too. Yeah, the interesting, but with that, so Sam is making the argument that this makes sense. This fits within his argument because it's saying that this proskuneo word is basically only used of Jesus, while this latreo word, which is the more, what would you say, the more sacrificial type of worship, the offering pleasing to the Lord, that sort of thing, is reserved for God the Father. Now, I think where this becomes a little more ambiguous and not so clear cut to me is that if we go over to John 4, what we see is that the same proskuneo word is actually used of God the Father. So what we say, this is the women at the well that Jesus is talking to. Let's see, gosh, this worship is used, this is proskuneo. This is used like 10 different times within this passage. And I'm reading from the Net Bible, by the way. So this woman said to him, "Sir, I see that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain and say that the place where the people must worship in Jerusalem, blah, blah, blah." It's all of these instances of worship, and there's 10 of them, are all proskuneo. And, Jesus himself says, "Believe me, woman, a time is coming when you will proskuneo the Father, neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You people proskuneo what you do not know. We proskuneo what we know, because salvation is And so, anyways, it goes on like that. So I think the point is here is not that I don't think this totally debunks Sam's argument in itself. I think the point is that this proskuneo word is used of both the Father and Jesus in the Gospel of John. So this sort of clear division between, Jesus only gets proskuneo, the Father only gets latreo, is, I don't know, I guess it's just not clear to me. Let's see here. Let me just look at my other notes. I think another interesting part of this here is the Trinity. This is sort of a side note, but in John, again in John 4, worship the Father in spirit and in truth. And why I think that's interesting is because we have this Trinitarian echo sort of going on here. So the proskuneo to the Father is being mediated through spirit, the Holy Spirit, and in truth, which is, Jesus calls himself the way, the truth, and the life. And so I think that's something that I just noticed for the first time when I, was going over this text. So I don't think that adds much, for or against the argument, but I think, again, just to affirm the sense of mediation that we absolutely see, and that I think I would agree with Sam on, that there is some sense of mediation going on here. So yeah, I think Yeah, let's leave it at there. This John 4 will come up again because Sam actually brings it up himself, and specifically the idea of, worshiping in the place. So we will see more of that as we go.
Right? Gestures of respect to God and other worthy recipients, sacrificial worship only to God. And Jesus, of course, is repeating this in the New Testament. I think that we can all agree that the Old Testament has plenty of verses that I don't need to pull out about how worship should only be given to God. There's like too many.
Okay, let me go back and just look at this verse in particular. So I think the sort of implicit argument that Sam is going to rely on here, in not just this instance, but a few other instances here, is the idea that Jesus is, how would you say this? That the implication that Jesus is worshiping his Father or participating in the right worship that is, attributed to the Father is in and of itself and a clear statement that Jesus was not in fact divine. He was not in fact capital G God. So I don't know if that holds, because maybe this will get clear and I'll be able to develop my thoughts more as we go here. But I think the potential issue here is that in the classic statement about the nature of Christ, I don't actually see any problem with this whatsoever, because I can say, well, yeah, I mean, Jesus was a man, he was a human, and he was the perfect ideal human that showed us how to properly latreo the Father in every sense of the word. And that's something Sam would totally agree with. The question is, does that fact inherently contradict the idea that Jesus could also have been fully divine? And this is sort of the point where we sort of get out of the scope of Sam's presentation. And so I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole, because that wouldn't be fair to the content that he's put in front of us. But it's something that I always have in the back of my mind when I listen to this, is I don't see the inherent contradiction between those things. And I think it would be interesting to flesh that out a little more. Why so Jesus is worshiping the Father in the same way that any other, righteous, pious man would do. Therefore, Jesus is necessarily, cannot be divine, capital D divine. I mean, I don't know. I don't follow the train of thought, and Sam doesn't make that explicit here. So just to be fair, but I think that's sort of the implicit thing that we'll see as he sort of interprets, this verse and more of these verses going forward.
Verses to count, and Jesus reiterates that here in the New Testament. So let's dig into the Old Testament a little bit more. So this is from Deuteronomy. This is right before the Hebrews are going to enter the promised land. And God is giving the Hebrews a lot of commands about what the God of your fathers has given you to possess. Gift of service to God and a sacrificial worship. You shall take images of their gods and destroy their names out of their place. So another way that the pagans were doing worshiping is that they have carved images. Carved icons are idols. Not worship the Lord your God and put his name, not the name of many gods, singular name, and make his habitation there.
Okay, so here's where John 4 comes back into place. But you shall seek the place that the Lord your God will choose out of all your tribes to put his name and make his habitation there. And this is pretty much verbatim reflected in John 4. The Samaritan woman says, our fathers worshipped on this mountain. So there's your place. And you people, that is the Jews, say that the place where people must worship is in Jerusalem. So this Deuteronomy text is in Hebrew, of course. But I think Sam is making the argument here that this is latreo worship, because it is, worship devoted to Yahweh, God the Father. But yet in John 4, we see that the word here always used is proskuneo in the exact same context. Jesus says directly, with respect to the Father, that this is, let's see, let me pull up some of my notes here just to get this right. So Jesus talks about this very place in John 4 because the Samaritan woman brings it up. And again, this is Jesus is directly attributing proskuneo, not latreo, to the Father. So I think that if Sam's sort of argument of the exclusiveness of latreo with respect to the Father really holds, you would expect, I mean, you know, again, 10 different instances of worship in this verse, you would expect, especially in this context in John 4, you would expect all of them to be latreo following this argument, but they're all proskuneo. So I think that probably weakens his argument a little bit. So, and, you know, it doesn't totally knock it down because, you know, Sam would rightly respond, well, we don't see latreo used with respect to Christ in the New Testament, and fair enough. I'll take him at his word that he's right on that. So again, it's not like the argument is a total knockdown because we're more concerned with the nature of Christ here, but then than the nature of the Father. But just because we see these two different words used, or this one word used for both Christ and the Father, I think the argument is weakened a little bit, especially since we're seeing, Jesus and the Samaritan women are talking about the exact same thing as, is being spoken about in this Deuteronomy passage.
There you shall go, and there you shall bring your burnt offerings and your sacrifices, your tithes and contributions that you present, your vow offerings, your free will offerings, and the firstborn of your herd and of your flock. So how are you worshiping God?
So again, all of these things that are, I think Sam is construing as the latreo worship, as that is what we see in other passages. But in John 4, Jesus calls all of this proskuneo.
You're giving all of these different categories of offerings up to God. Some of them are animal sacrifices. Some of them are even like financial, right? And there you shall eat before the Lord your God. So I think another thing that we often don't understand is that one of the ways that you can worship God is by eating. So how do you worship?
And I mean, the question here is, as Christians, we're going to say that the fulfillment, and there you shall eat before the Lord your God. We're going to say that the fulfillment of that is the Eucharist. And I think that there is an important sense where when we partake of the bread and the wine, you shall eat before the Lord your God, we are absolutely eating this, before Christ himself. Like, as a high church Protestant, at least I have high church theological tendencies, I say that the bread and the wine really is Christ himself. And again, Sam will talk about the Eucharist more, in the future, so I shouldn't get too ahead of myself. But the point is that this is exactly the sort of thing that Christ invited his disciples to partake in with him at the Last Supper, which is another thing Sam will bring up. So I will shut up for now and let's continue.
God by eating. When you offer an animal as sacrifice to God, you normally burn up the nice parts, right? Like sometimes it's like all those weird passages in Leviticus where it's like, well, you take the fat from the kidneys and you put it on the altar. Like, what's going on with that, right? You give God the nice parts of the animal, you burn them up on the altar, right? Which sends them up to God. But then what do you do with the rest of the animal? Well, the people participating in the worship ceremony then get to eat the animal, and you're sort of having a feast with God as a guest, right? So you eat the animal, and that's part of the worship ceremony. And you shall rejoice, right? I don't want to say singing's bad. I made fun of the skinny jeans a little earlier, but singing is a part of it. It's just sort of more like an adornment, and it's not really the central part. And you and your house.
Which, again, just to beat the high church horse here, that's how it should be.
In all that you undertake, which the Lord your God has blessed you. So I want to look at another example of sacred worship meals. So this is from a passage that's explaining the proper ritual for giving the ordination to a new priest. So after the new priests who are getting ordained put on the new clothes and they get sprinkled with some blood to atone for their sins, you shall take the ram of ordination and boil its flesh in a holy place. And Aaron and his sons shall eat the flesh of the ram and the bread that is in the basket in the entrance of the tent of meeting. They shall eat those things with which atonement was made. They shall eat those things with which atonement was made. I'll come back to that in the New Testament in a bit. at their ordination and consecration, but an outsider shall not eat of them because they are holy. And what's holy? It's the food that's holy. And if any of the flesh for the ordination of the bread remain until morning, then you shall burn the remainder with fire, and it shall not be eaten because it is holy. So you can't have holy leftovers lying around, right? If you make some holy food during a holy sacred meal, the people participating in the ceremony eat it. Any leftovers have to get burnt so that no one unworthy to be part of that ceremony eats part of that animal, because that would be a very bad thing to do. All right, so talking a little bit about worship and veneration distinction between the king and God. So this is right near the end of David's life. He's about to...
So I think, let me just back up there and see if there's anything I wanted to say. So again, I think Jesus describes all of this as proskuneo in John 4, which is the same sort of worship that he himself receives, on a couple of occasions, most explicitly in John 9 from the blind man who he healed. So again, I have to sort of restrain myself because I don't want to make too much hay out of this argument, but I think it's worth noting that to me, it seems, at least with proskuneo, I don't know about latreo, but at least with proskuneo, there is crossover between how, if you're going to look at a strict syntactical, word-based case, there is crossover between how that word applies to both the Father and the Son, is basically my point.
And all the assembly blessed the God of their fathers and bowed their heads and paid homage to the Lord and the King. So both God and the King simultaneously are receiving bows of homage to them, right? That is veneration, right? That's proskuneo. All right, and they offered sacrifices to the Lord, and on the next day offered burnt offerings to the Lord, 1,000 bulls, 1,000 rams, and 1,000 lambs, and with their drink offerings and sacrifices in abundance for all Israel, and they ate and drank.
Again, and I think I'm not convinced of, because like as concepts, we can apply these. I think applying these two different concepts of worship is a valid move, proskuneo versus latreo, as we take them as isolated concepts. But I think that is still kind of limited because, so I think Sam would rightly point out that at this point, and what he's got highlighted in yellow there, the Lord, God the Father can receive proskuneo worship. And, again, John 4, we see that. But again, the point of John 4 is the specific context. Oh, they're coming to this mountain. We are worshiping on this mountain. And everything that implies about that is all the sacrifices and all of the burnt offerings and everything that comes along with that. So I think, again, the crossover here is it seems kind of explicit here if we compare it to John 4.
Before the Lord on that day with great gladness, right? So are the sacrifices being offered to King David? No, the sacrifices are to God, and King David is participating. The homage is to King David and God, but the sacrifices are just to God, right? And they ate and drank before the Lord. It's a worship feast. All of Israel is celebrating the king and giving worship to God. How do you do that? You eat the animals that were sacrificed, right? It's a sacred worship feast for all of Israel. Okay, Psalm 45. My heart overflows with a pleasing theme. I address my verses to the king. My tongue is like the pen of a ready scribe. You are the most handsome of the sons of men. Grace is poured upon your lips. Therefore, God has blessed you forever. Gird your sword on your thigh, O mighty one, in your splendor and majesty. Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. The scepter of your kingdom is a scepter of uprightness, and you have...
What's interesting about this passage is the sort of intermingling between the roles of God and the king. I address my verses to the king. You're the most, handsome of the sons of men. So clearly this is a human being, a man. Therefore God has blessed you forever. Now it's not clear to me when, gird your sword on your thigh, O mighty one, in your splendor and majesty. Okay, is that referring to God or the king? And I think I point that out because now we say your throne, kingly language, oh God, is forever and ever. So and again, it's poetic, so you can't read too much into this, but there's sort of an interesting intermingling with language. And I think there's going to be another passage that Sam brings up that I think will maybe make this a little more clear with respect to Jesus.
Loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore, God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness beyond your companions. So this is a song of praise in the book of Psalms in the Old Testament. Who is the recipient of this psalm? I address my verses to the king. So is singing a song of praise a violation of the commandment to worship only God? No, it is appropriate to sing a song of praise to the king. You can even call him splendor and majesty.
Well, and again, I don't think it's just to the king. I think it's both to the king and God. I mean, of course, it explicitly says, oh, I'm addressing this to the king. But, as it goes on, it's clear that God is right there in the mix.
Some people even think your throne, O God, refers to the king, where the king is called, O God. There's some textual dispute. It might be your throne is God, but that...
Yeah, so he's bringing up basically the point that I mentioned. The verse is not entirely clear, even in English.
That distinction actually isn't important to what I'm trying to say. You can give a song of praise to a king, and it is not violating the command to worship only God, because a song of praise actually technically counts as veneration for a worthy recipient, not worship itself, right? That's kind of my point. Music...
Now, I think the move to veneration that he's made here is maybe, I think, and I don't think he's intending to be confusing here, but I think, he's basically trying to make it like, oh, this is the English shorthand for proskuneo. And fair enough, but I think veneration has a certain amount of baggage and connotation to it in English that is, I think, for at least Catholics and Orthodox are, very much distinct from, the worship that they would give to God. And, Sam is going to address this, so I'll leave it there.
And songs of praise, them by themselves, are not what counts as worship. So, summarizing a little bit, Old Testament definitions of worship and veneration. Worship, sacrifices offered to a deity as an expression of thanks in a ritualized context. Veneration, various actions such as physical gestures or praise that demonstrate submission and respect in order to give honor, glorious status to the recipient. Clear enough? All right, so I have 3 columns: Old Covenant worship, New Covenant physical, New Covenant spiritual. I'll explain those last 2 columns later. I'm just going to fill out the first column here. So where was Old Covenant worship done? It was either done in the tabernacle or the Jerusalem temple, one particular place. What's offered as sacrifice? Mostly animals, but it could be other food like wine or bread, or sometimes financial help, and sometimes given worship. Only God the Father.
Fast forward through this section, because I think, this is just summarizing what he's already discussed. So, okay, I think this is where, let's see if I have something to say about this. This is 1918. Okay, we'll let him go.
So this is from Luke chapter 2. This is when Jesus is a baby. When the time came for their purification according to the law of Moses, they, that is Joseph and Mary, brought him up to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord, as is written in the law of the Lord. Every male who first opens the womb shall be called holy to the Lord, and to offer a sacrifice according to what's said in the law of the Lord, a pair of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, right? So how do you...
No, I think the way you could read this as a Trinitarian is to say, via the incarnation, Jesus, the eternal Logos has become flesh. And so Jesus is now embodying and perfectly fulfilling the law as he intended, because, the idea is he's God, of course. So I think the fact that he's participating in this does not, again, it doesn't seem like any sort of disqualification that he could be simultaneously human and divine, which again, that's a broader theological point that's getting beyond the scope of Sam's presentation. But I bring that up because the sort of, let's say, low Christological interpretation Sam is going to give here is not going to be very convincing to me. For that reason, we sort of have to address, why there's necessarily a contradiction here between Jesus having a, fully human and fully divine nature.
Worship God, you offer a sacrifice. This is appropriate sacrifice for when the son is a firstborn child. So Mary, Joseph, and Jesus are together performing this ritual. That's an act of worship of God that Jesus, even as a baby, is participating in.
And again, if Jesus is a full man, is fully man, then we should expect him to worship God. I mean, if he's not fully man, then, or let's say if he's not worshiping the Father in spirit and in truth, like he, instructs us to, then, it really calls into the question, okay, is this really the guy, we're looking for, right? Is he really the ideal man who incorporates all of humanity into himself and perfects it?
All right, so this is from John chapter 4. Jesus is talking to the woman at the well. The woman said to him, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship." Jesus said to her,
and again, just as a side note, every worship word in here is proskuneo, not latreo.
"Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know." Jesus is including himself as a Jew and as a worshiper of God in the Jewish tradition, right?
So again, I don't have any problem with this. I mean, Jesus was a Jew. Jesus was fully man. I don't think any of this speaks against Jesus also, being, fully divine in his nature.
Jesus is saying, we as in I too worship God, right? For salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming and now is here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father is seeking such people to worship him. So Jesus is alluding to the fact that worship is about to change. There's some change imminent to the Jewish worship of God. So let's go into that a little bit. So this is from the Last Supper. So he, Jesus, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And likewise, the cup, after they had eaten, saying, "This cup is poured out for you, is the new covenant and my blood." So Jesus says, given for you and poured out for you. This is the language of sacrifice. Jesus is describing himself as a sacrificial offering, but it's not to himself, nor is it to the disciples. It's for the disciples present. It's poured out for you, but who's it given to? I think the obvious implication is that this is being given to God the Father.
And I disagree that this is an obvious implication. I think it is an obvious implication if you assume Sam's argument, but that's the point. This is the argument that he's sort of making here. So to me, I don't see that it is strictly or necessarily the Father alone. I mean, you sort of have to get what the pattern that it fits into is certainly the more latreo type worship that we see through the Old Testament. And of course, the Eucharist is the fulfillment of all of that. But I don't think, again, you sort of have to assume at least part of Sam's argument here, and part of his Christology to, make it clearly obvious, because Sam himself mentioned that we're looking at such a radical change in how worship to God is performed, and who it's open to and how it functions, and that's being instituted here at the Last Supper. And so to just sort of necessarily assume the exact same logic of the Old Testament, I think is a bit disjoint with what actually could be going on here. And again, this is not like some a lemma that's going to disprove Sam's argument. I'm just saying it's more ambiguous, and what I'm saying is sort of, I think, weakening his case.
So whenever there is a covenant, there is a establishment of the right rituals of worship that go along with the covenant. The old covenant had like pages and pages and pages about how to do worship correctly. So when there's a new covenant, there's going to be a new regime of worship. So this is from Hebrews chapter 9. When Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things that have come, then through the greater and more perfect tent, not made with hands, that is not of this creation, he entered once and for all into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption. For the blood of goats and bulls and the sprinkling of defiled persons with the ashes of a heifer sanctify for the purification of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience from dead works to serve the living God? So what's going on here? There's a parallel and contrast between the worship of the old covenant and the worship of the new covenant. The good things that have come, that's the new covenant. Jesus is now worshiping in a greater and more perfect tent or tabernacle, right? Hebrews worshiped in a tabernacle made with hands in the desert. Jesus is leading worship in the heavenly tabernacle, not made with hands, not of this creation, right? Old covenant, blood of goats. New covenant, blood of Jesus, right? Old covenant, you had to constantly re-purify yourself with more blood from animals because like your atonement would sort of wear off, so you need to keep redoing it, right? Jesus secures an eternal redemption once and for all with his own blood.
And so there's a few things here. I don't think I disagree with anything that Sam has just said about this passage. Again, it's the sort of assuming the argument of the Christology and sort of the prior arguments about the sort of latreo worship necessarily devoted to God the Father, and the proskuneo worship not necessarily but predominantly restricted to Jesus or other sort of kingly figures. But again, I mean, the interesting thing to me here is that this is called an eternal redemption, and we see through the eternal Spirit, the eternal Holy Spirit, and I think that eternal word is something important to not gloss over. And again, getting into the nature, the eternal nature of Christ and the Spirit is beyond the discussion that Sam is trying to have here, of course. So, but I think the fact that that's even mentioned is the Eastern Church Fathers, who I'm not as familiar with as I should be, I believe they talk about how the sacrifice of Christ on the cross was eternal in a sense, and they sort of play out the metaphysical aspects of it in their discussion. And so Hebrews at least is certainly saying that this sort of thing is eternal, that this sort of worship, this new regime of worship that Christ is instituting, is in a sense what he has been doing in heaven all along, from the beginning, from all eternity.
Right. And so this is all to serve the living God, right? And that word serve there is not just like do nice things. It is offer ritual sacrifices to God. All right, so let's start filling out the other couple columns on this chart. So I think that the interesting thing about New Covenant worship in contrast with Old Covenant worship, in Old Covenant worship, all of the stuff and people was here on earth. But in New Covenant worship, there is an earthly action that is parallel to and connected with a spiritual action in heaven. So let me demonstrate what I mean. So where did New Covenant worship happen? It can happen anywhere that Christians gather, right? Jesus, talking to the Samaritan woman, said, you don't worship on that mountain, you worship in Jerusalem. But time's coming where that location will not be the location of worship anymore.
I think this is basically correct, and I'm a Protestant, so I'm inclined to agree with Sam on this. Though I think, the Catholics and Orthodox should probably put an asterisk or two on that. In terms of, they would not regard the sort of, a bunch of Christians coming informal into a house church to be equivalent to, entering into the designated consecrated, church or cathedral or place of worship and participating in the Eucharist or something. But that's, I think, a minor point.
New location is anywhere Christians gather. But in a certain sense, there actually is only one location, and that one location is the heavenly temple, the heavenly tabernacle.
I'm going to just skip ahead here because I think what we'll see is that pretty much agree on, the first five.
Aiding in the worship of God, being led by Jesus.
And then we'll get to the sixth.
Who is the recipient? And this is my biggest point. While many things changed between Old Covenant and New Covenant worship, the recipient does not change. The recipient of the worship in the New Covenant is Yahweh or God the Father. It is not Jesus. It is not the Trinity. It is not.
Now, I guess I'm not. I think, again, how do you even phrase this? Sam is, in fact, laying out here the maybe not the disjoint, but the fulfillment of the Old Covenant in the New Covenant that looks so much different and has such a radical, has consistency, but at the same time, such a radical break from the Old Covenant of how worship is performed. And, I am in total agreement with here across, the first five of these rows, basically. So I think the fact that we see such a disjoint here, it doesn't necessarily imply, but it leaves room open for the idea that a fuller revelation of the God to whom we are providing this worship to, this proskuneo, this latreo worship to, is revealed in a totally new and an insane way. Insane to, the Jews at the time, certainly, when they heard it. And so I guess, I look at that chart, and let's see if I can phrase what I would think I would require here is sort of an overwhelming chain of evidence to say that the who is receiving column is completely consistent all the way through, when the other, or the who is receiving row, I should say, when the other 5 rows are, radical transformations of what came before in the old covenant, right? And I don't think, and again, to be respectful to Sam on this, he's only up here for 40 minutes. He doesn't have time to, tear apart this case. You could probably do multiple books. You could do volumes and volumes on trying to, tease out all of the details here. But I don't think, sort of partially for the reason that I've mentioned, that I don't think the fact that Jesus worshiped God the Father is a necessary contraindication against Jesus also having a divine nature. And the other stuff that I've been talking about, I don't think that the case that Sam has built is, strong enough for me to agree that there is, a complete, totally unchanged continuity from the old covenant to the new covenant and who is receiving the worship. But in every other aspect of the worship, we see a radical transformation. I don't think that I think if Sam were able to put forward just an enormous preponderance of evidence for that to be the case, then I might be rethinking things. But what he's presented so far here is not convincing to me.
Anything else, it is God the Father, the same as it was in the Old Covenant. There's no change in the recipient. All right, so let's dig into some of the things that I just said a little bit. So this is from 1 Corinthians 5. For though absent in body, I, Paul, am present in spirit, and as if present, I have already pronounced judgment on the one who did such a thing, right? He's talking about there's someone who's engaged in sexual immorality. When you are assembled in the name of our Lord Jesus, and my spirit is present with the power of our Lord Jesus. So there, when you pray and you call...
So the interesting thing here, the name of the Lord Jesus, right? And so that direct correspondence between the name of the Lord, which appears so frequently in the Old Testament, directly connected to this man Jesus. So I think there's something, there's a divine Christological overtone going on there, and Sam has had discussions on this on his channel, and we've had text chat discussions about this for a lot. So this is sort of, I think, grounds that he would have a good response to. But yeah, let's continue.
All upon the name of the Lord as a gathered Christian assembly, you connect up, kind of, in some sense, with Jesus, and Jesus is present there, even though Jesus is in the heavenly tabernacle. This picture, it's from a Mormon website.
And just as a side note, the Mormons always have the best art. I feel like you could do, a course that I would have liked to take in school, a super niche course, is like study of Mormon art or something. That would be quite entertaining.
Mormons have a little bit of cheesy artwork sometimes, but I think this does a good job of making my point, right? Earthly congregation here, Jesus in the high priestly garments in the heavenly tabernacle is like the real leader, even though it's invisible.
Now, I think, again, the crossover that Jesus participates in between heaven and earth is fully, to me, I mean, that to me begs of an incarnational logic of the joining to heaven and earth. If Jesus is doing that in everything that he does, in terms of how he leads us into worship and he leads humanity into the place that God intended it to be all along, the fact that Jesus acted that out perfectly, the reunion of heaven and earth, in his actions, points to me that there was a fundamental union of heaven and earth in his very nature. And, that's where we get fully God and fully man. So that to me points into a high Christological direction.
He's there spiritually. All right, so that kind of highlights that first row that I was saying. All right, further on in 1 Corinthians, therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. I speak as to sensible people. Judge for yourselves what I say. The cup of blessing that we bless, is it not a participation?
I'm just going to skip ahead here to where pretty sure he highlights this. Yeah.
What do all three of them have in common? There is a sacrifice that is eaten by the participants, right? Old covenant, right? The people who ate the sacrifices. The reason, have you ever wondered why the New Testament makes such a big deal about eating meat sacrificed to idols, right? That's a constant thing that people are wrestling with. It's because it's idolatry. Why? Because the meat was from an animal that was sacrificed to an idol, like, that like Ganesh statue. So you can't eat the bananas that were given to Ganesh. You can't eat you can't drink the red Fanta if it was given to Ganesh, because that is participating in the idolatry of that pagan god, right? And that's offered to demons. This parallel only makes sense if, in the same sense, partaking of the bread and the wine is also a ritual meal eaten together as a sacrifice, right? Paul's parallel and contrast here only makes sense if the new covenant thing is of the same type as the old covenant and the pagan thing, right? And you bless the cup, right? Further on in first.
So again, like, just to connect this back to his table, he's making the case that there's a continuity, yet a transformation going from the old to the new covenant.
Corinthians. Whoever therefore eats the bread and drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty concerning the body and blood of the Lord. Let a person examine himself then, and so eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For anyone who eats and drinks without discerning the body eats and drinks judgment on himself. That's why many of you are weak and ill, and some have died. So I'm not sure how many times there's been a sermon on this passage, but most people don't talk about dying based off of doing the Lord's Supper improperly. But that is exactly what Paul is saying. But if
this is really why the Zwinglians just wanted to, sort of tamp down the Eucharist to just be like, hey, well, if we don't take it that seriously, maybe we could just ignore this conveniently.
You remember the passage that I talked about the priests and the ordination, right? The food that had been made holy needed to be burned if it wasn't finished, so that no one unworthy would eat that food and participate in that ritual, because that would be a bad thing. This is exactly what Paul is making the argument for, that if you participate in the Lord's Supper in an unworthy manner, you are inviting God's judgment on you, and it might make you sick or even kill you. So I think that's what's going on.
And I've heard no modern cases of people actually getting sick or being killed. But I think, I agree with all of this, what Sam just said. I don't see, again, no reason to see this as a contradiction with the potential divinity of Christ.
All right, so all that to back up. New covenant, what's being offered? In an earthly sense, bread and wine, but in a spiritual sense, Jesus's body and blood in the heavenlies. All right, so this is from the Didache, or the Didache, or if you're Italian, the Didache.
The Didache, you can tell how if you're listening to both of us, you can tell how much of the upper Midwest Sam and I are from. So
the Didache was a document probably from the 1st century. It's sort of like a Christian worship manual. Sean talked about that Armenian book, right? It wasn't exactly a theological treatise, right? It's an instruction for how to do a bunch of things. That's what the Didache is, and it's very similar to the Gospel of Matthew. And some people think it was either written by the same author or part of the same community, or at least very heavily influenced. So it's sort of, I'm not saying that the Didache has the same level of authority as Scripture, but it's a very important historical witness to some of the stuff that I'm trying to talk about. So every Lord's Day, right? Every Lord's Day, what's the Lord's Day? That's Sunday. And I think that you can draw a couple places from 1 Corinthians that are also implying that it's a weekly thing. So every Lord's Day, gather yourselves together, break bread, and give thanksgiving. All right, so I've been using the word Eucharist, and I know for some people are like, Sam, that's the Catholic word. You can't use the Catholic word. It's Lord's Supper or it's communion. Eucharist is a perfectly good Greek word. Good, charis, grace, right? Or like even like from charisma, right? Gifts. So like Eucharist means it's the Greek word that the Septuagint translates for thank offering, right? It means giving good thanks. So or thanksgiving as
I'm glad Sam advocates this, because everybody should be, calling it the Eucharist.
It's often translated in English. So I'm using that word. A, it's easier to say, and B, it's a perfectly good biblical word. All right. And give thanksgiving after having confessed your transgressions, right? Paul said to examine yourself right before you participate. The Didache says, confess your transgressions so that your sacrifice may be pure, right? The bread and the wine are a sacrifice. It says it straight up. but let no one that is at variance with his fellow come together with you until they be reconciled, right? In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus says, if you're on your way to the temple and you remember your brother has something against you, go back to your brother, be reconciled before you go on your way, right? That's repeating that same sort of idea, that your sacrifice may not be profaned. For this is that which was spoken by the Lord. In every place and time, offer me a pure sacrifice, for I am a great king, says the Lord, and my name is wonderful among the nations. And I could make a very strong case contextually that the Lord here is God the Father, right? Who is the sacrifice to? The sacrifice is to God the Father.
Again, I think this assumes the argument. This assumes the argument he's making, that there is a complete continuity between just who the worship is given to, despite the fact that there's quite a transformation of every other aspect of how the worship is performed. So maybe Sam has other evidence to say that, this great king, the Lord here is referring to only God the Father. But to me, the fact that Christ acquires the title Lord in the New Testament, and he's also, of course, regarded as the king, I think that really does not make this line of argument to me very convincing.
What is the offering? It's Jesus. So, okay, Sam, what you've been saying is very good and interesting, but what about Revelation 5? Surely, if there's any place where Jesus is worshipped in the New Testament, it's Revelation 5. How could you say that is not worship of Jesus? All right, so I was making this slide while the Queen of England was still alive, and I was like, oh man, I'm going to talk about coronation ceremonies. Everyone think that's kind of weird and irrelevant, but now everyone gets to think about coronation ceremonies. So, silver lining, I guess. So during, too soon, I'm sorry, maybe, okay, all right. So during a coronation ceremony, the monarch takes an oath, right? An oath of, being a good monarch. The monarch is anointed. The monarch is crowned and enthroned. Lots of prayers and songs happen. Representatives of the realm come.
Again, pay attention here. In the previous passage that Sam just looked at, the Lord is described as the king. And he's making the argument. He made the argument there that this was God the Father, and now we're going to have this, very similar, perhaps same kingly language in Revelation, and now he's going to make the argument that this is now exclusively God the Son, it seems to me.
Come and pay homage in submission to the new monarch. And so this is a quotation, right? King Charles, he's ascended to the throne, but he hasn't had his full coronation ceremony, right? It's like he's engaged, but hasn't gotten married yet, right? So the full coronation ceremony is going to happen, I think, sometime in the spring. And this is a quote from it. Sirs, I here present unto you Charles III, your undoubted king. Wherefore, all you who are come this day to do your homage and service, are you willing to do the same? All right, so with coronation ceremonies in mind, let's read Revelation 5, 6-8. And between the throne and the four living creatures, and among the elders, I saw a lamb standing, as though it had been slain, with 7 horns and with 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent out into all the earth. And he went and took the scroll from the right hand of him who was seated on the throne. And when he had taken the scroll, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb, each holding a harp and golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the...
So there's a few things going on here. The 7 spirits of God as... let's say, okay, I should probably stop myself here, because you can never read much at all into Revelation. It's just so ridiculously, symbolic and rather hidden. But, the 7 spirits of God, well, whatever the heck that means, maybe the least that we can say about it, that it speaks of a very profound integration between the Lamb, Christ, and the Spirit of God. And I don't think Sam would disagree with that statement. But I think what it may also add to is Sam's argument here does rely on some distinct separation between the worship that goes only to God the Father and the worship that goes to the Son. And again, Revelation is notoriously tricky. Maybe we shouldn't even, read that much into it at all. But I think the fact that the description of the Lamb is so integrated into, let's see, whatever the 7 spirits of God are, some very, profound manifestation or embodiment of God himself. I think speaks, that in itself suggests mixture and crossover as opposed to, two rather separate means of worship to me. And then the second thing is the golden bowls full of incense. So I'm going to, forget the part, where exactly this is in the Torah, somewhere in Leviticus, I assume. That's always a safe bet. Of the exact function of the golden bowls are full of incense, but of course Revelation is making a callback to that. So I think the fact that all of these elders are offering the prayers of the saints, these golden bowls full of incense, and you could think because the priest was offering golden, I think again I may have this a little bit wrong, but golden bowls full of incense. The Levitical priests were offering this to Yahweh on behalf of the nation of Israel, and now these elders, which are high up in the hierarchy, they're sort of filling in for a priestly role here in a sense, are offering up the prayers of the saints, which again I think are a stand-in. You could say that the prayers of the saints are a sort of spiritual stand-in for the physical objects that would be offered up by the Levitical priests. So I think let's see, the point there is that it sounds to me that these golden bowls full of incense, I mean, man, and these are being offered directly to the Lamb. Again, I don't, again, just to be clear, Revelation is so ambiguous that I'm not trying to make this an absolute positive case for a God being fully divine and fully worthy of the worship that should be due to divinity. But the fact that Revelation crosses these lines so much, I think, is again, goes against Sam's sort of contention that there is a relatively distinct division between the worship that is generally prescribed to the Father and that is generally prescribed to the Son.
Saints. And a little further on, and I heard every creature in heaven and on earth and under the earth and in the sea and all that is in them saying, to him who sits on the throne and to the Lamb be blessing and honor and glory and might forever and ever. And the four living creatures said, Amen. And the elders fell down and worshipped. What's that word? Worshipped? Proskuneo, right? Physical gesture. So this, I do not think, is a worship ceremony of Jesus.
And again, proskuneo was used in a very similar context, a very similar sort of, the place where the Lord has told you, blah, blah, blah. That connotation, or that sort of idea ran right through John 4, where proskuneo was also applied to the Father. So again, the point being that the categories are a lot blurrier than I think Sam is making them out to be.
I think that this is the coronation ceremony of Jesus. Jesus is the eternal Messiah. How could he not have a wonderful, grand coronation ceremony? If earthly kings and queens get coronation ceremonies, how much more so does their eternal Messiah?
So again, this goes back to the sort of underlying assumption that Sam seems to have of the necessary separation between the man Jesus and the fullness of divinity. And if we look at this passage again, I think the coronation is not inherently, just because there is a coronation of a human does not necessarily bar that human from also fully participating in divinity. At least that is, I've said this like a dozen times now. But again, this is maybe the biggest. I say it so many times because it's the biggest thing holding me back from accepting Sam's argument here, because the king is an identity that is equally and frequently bestowed on both Yahweh God the Father, and also the person Jesus Christ. And so there's such a mingling of identities and titles here that I don't think this really is evidence for some sort of sharp distinction between the kinds of worship that the Father and the Son should respectively receive.
Messiah get a coronation ceremony. So I was trying to come up with a picture to articulate what I was trying to say, and this is the best I could do. So what I think is going on in Revelation, right? So we've got Rafiki, right, holding up Simba, right? We have his father and his mother in the background. We have animals in the sky, animals on earth, animals in the water, and like even Scar and the hyenas are like under the earth, right? So we've got all the categories. Everyone is bowing down, right? We're all singing the circle of life. And none of you watched The Lion King and thought, man, they're idolatrously worshiping Simba there, aren't they? That's not right. You can't worship Simba. No, they're not worshiping Simba. This is, everyone in, the circle of life land, wherever this is coming to recognize the new king, right?
And so let me spin this into a, let's say, more interpretation that this is something respected to the, something that's brought with respect towards God, towards the divine. The interesting thing about this is, and this is going to be super tenuous, because again, this is like an animated Disney movie. It's not the Bible. But maybe you could make a case that the pattern here of all these different kinds of animals coming from all over the place represents all the different nations that will, again, in the vision of Revelation, will come into the holy city and, bring their offerings to worship the Lord. And I think in the actual movie, I think they just bow to him basically, which, that's the proskuneo stuff that Sam is talking about, of course. So the symbolic analogy is not total one-to-one, but I think the point is, again, it's like the elders are offering these golden bowls with incense towards directly to the person of Christ. And so again, maybe I should go back and read, what exactly, how this corresponded to the Levitical priesthood. But, the point remains is that to me sounds like a lot more like latreo than it does proskuneo, specifically the golden bowls, with the incense that represents the saint, the prayers of the saints.
Right? Everyone bows down, songs that are appropriate, et cetera, et cetera. That's what I think Revelation 5 really is about. Okay, so something about Mary. All right, so I have been using the distinction. So if who here's ever argued with a Catholic or an Orthodox person about the appropriateness of what they do to Mary, right? And if you say, hey, you're worshiping Mary, they'll be like, no, there's a worship veneration distinction. We worship the Trinity, we venerate Mary and the saints. You have to understand this distinction, right? And I am halfway acknowledging their point that there is a clear distinction between worship and veneration. That's the main point I've been making about the distinction between God and Jesus. But that does not mean that all veneration is appropriate, right? So this is a quote from Dr. Rubenstein on how Jesus became God. To the extent that Latin Christians felt the need for a heavenly mediator between man and God, that role was played by the cults of the saints and especially the cult of the Virgin Mary, which was greatly strengthened by the triumph of Nicene orthodoxy. So when orthodoxy moved Jesus into the Godhead, instead of having him be a mediator between God and man, that left a role.
So right there, I have to stop it right there, because, moving him into the Godhead and him also being a mediator between God and man are not mutually contradictory things to my view. I think that's something that Sam is bringing in as an assumption that, again, dissecting that assumption is, again, outside of the scope of his talk. So I don't blame him for that. But, besides that, I'm like in total agreement with him on the Mary thing. Because, I'm a Protestant, and I think, maybe the biggest thing I probably object to in Catholicism and Orthodoxy is the I think overly high place of Mary. And, so I guess I halfway agree with Sam in the sense that I think his critique is spot on about the role that Mary has come to occupy. And but that being a necessary consequence of, you know, the ascendancy of Nicene orthodoxy, I'm not so sure about that. Yeah, I think ideally, to me, Jesus is already the perfect human. You don't need any other mediator we don't need any other mediator between us and the Father besides Jesus. So to me, to throw Mary into the mix, or to throw the saints into the mix as what would you say, distinct, like extra mediators on top of that, I guess I'm just not sure what the saints are doing that Jesus could not already do, you know, perfectly well and much better because he's Jesus. So anyways, side discussion, but since Sam was bringing it up.
Vacant. And his point, and I think that he's right, is that Mary sort of filled that vacuum in the spiritual imagination of Catholics and Orthodox. I think that is a grave mistake, to not have Jesus where he is due and to have his mother in his stead.
And again, 100% agree with that. You know, we're coming at it from different angles, but I think we're both getting to the right answer.
And I would also add that you can give veneration without giving it to a carved.
Okay, video is
carved icon or statue. And the New Testament never reverses the commandment about not making graven images. And so I would say, just because I agree that there's a distinction between worship and veneration, that doesn't mean that all recipients of veneration are, that doesn't mean that you can do it to anyone, or that there aren't inappropriate ways of doing it. So I would say, even still, I acknowledge Catholics and Orthodox, your distinction, but I don't think you're doing it properly. You're giving Mary the attention that's due to her son, and you're doing it with graven images, and both of those things are inappropriate for that reason.
Yeah, and so the interesting part of it, I mean, you sort of mentioned graven images and as offhand here. Sam and I have had discussions about this before, and my contention is that I am completely fine, and I think, you know, I would be fine encouraging iconography of Christ himself. I am not so keen on iconography of, you know, not Christ, you know, other saints and you know, and Mary and whatnot, because you know, Sam didn't say this, but I think this is what he would totally agree with, is we should be taking the second commandment pretty seriously. And you know, this is, I think, one of the most important points that I agree with Sam with, that he's making here, is having our worship and veneration set up properly is extremely important. So, I mean, you know, now that I've sort of criticized the Catholic and the Orthodox approaches, I should just clarify that I'm, you know, I'm incredibly respectful and, you know, have a lot of awe for what the Catholics and Orthodox have done in their traditions. And so, you know, just because I object to, you know, the veneration of saints and their, you know, the veneration of non-Christ saints in iconography, doesn't mean that the whole thing is necessarily idolatry to me, because I think God carries on tradition in an important place. And so, I don't know. I've been pretty convinced that tradition is very important. And so I would cast aside, I would just, you know, I would feel very uncomfortable for that reason of just offhandedly just rejecting, you know, all of the sort of, you know, the sort of veneration practices of Catholicism and Orthodoxy as necessarily, you know, heretical or idolatrous or something. That's something I have to think about more.
Reason. So I will say, in conclusion, full worship is centered around sacrifice. Music is all well and good. I love playing guitar as much as the next person. I love singing a good worship song. Although that one, we're getting back to the heart of worship, because it's all about you. It's all about you, Jesus, right? You guys know the one that I'm talking about. Well, first off, it's not all about Jesus, because, you know,
this is really hilarious to me, and Sam will know, because you know, I grew up very charismatic, and that song is an absolute classic. And yeah, charismatics are not known for their doctrinal precision, which I think has its advantages and disadvantages, but Sam is sort of pointing that out right now.
Jesus has a father. And secondly, music isn't, the heart of worship. The heart of worship is centered around sacrifice.
Which is really interesting to me, because I think Sam is actually, when he says that, he is exposing a sort of interesting contradiction in his approach to Unitarianism, and what Unitarianism has historically arisen out of is low church, restorationist evangelicalism, that sort of thing. I mean, maybe I should have said this at the start of the video, but Sam is not a Unitarian in sort of the Unitarian Universalist Association. He wants to be as far away from those people as possible. Again, Sam is an evangelical who doesn't check the Trinity or the deity of Jesus box. That's basically the best way to think about, the most concise way to think about Sam's perspective here. So he's taking all of this stuff seriously, as you can obviously tell. Gosh, what was I saying? Okay, so the fact that this sort of biblical Unitarian movement arose out of low church evangelical Protestantism that didn't think that sacrifice was the center of worship, because they, I'm free to be made aware and corrected of exceptions here, but they don't take the Eucharist seriously, right? In the sense that they have, very sort of low, Zwinglian symbolic representations. That's how it was at my church where I grew up. We just did this once a month because it's in the Bible. Jesus told us to do it, but we don't really know what it means, and we're not bothering to figure out, right? And so I think what Sam is actually pointing here, ironically enough, is back towards a high church perspective. And once you embrace a high church perspective on the Eucharist, it's much, much harder to hold to a Unitarian perspective on Christ, because of the higher view, the real presence view of Christ that becomes incorporated once you take the high church perspective, which Sam is basically advocating for, in a sense. He's not high church, but what he's advocating for is that sacrifice should be the center of worship. And I say amen to that. The Eucharist is a sort of sacrifice, and I'll just leave it at that, because that's a whole nother discussion. Yeah.
And I think that that's clear both Old Testament and still New Testament. Early Christian worship was like a spiritualized transformation of Jewish worship centered upon the Eucharist, but the recipient remained Yahweh, or God the Father. The recipient was not changed. Jesus was not added. The Holy Spirit was not.
Again, I'm not sure about this. I don't think, this goes back to the point that the idea that there's absolute continuity with the who is receiving the worship, who the worship is directed to, and yet there's not continuity with all of the other aspects of the worship. That's again a part of the logic that I'm not convinced of. Yeah, I think, I have to admit, it does sound a little weird to me to say that, Christ, the real, Christ in the Eucharist is being offered up also to Christ because he's God. And it does sound a little weird to me, I'll be honest. And it's something I would have to look into a little more. But it's absolutely being offered to God. And there's absolutely a cross-pollination in the titles and the identities that God is ascribed to, between the titles that Yahweh in the Old Testament and Jesus in the New Testament are, respectively ascribed. They both get Lord, they both get King. There's a lot of crossover. And I'm really disagreeing with Sam's interpretation of that Revelation passage. I see a lot of crossover between how worship to Yahweh was construed in the Old Testament and how that's being fulfilled in this Revelation passage in the New Testament with respect to Jesus.
Added, I could also say there's no record of any worship of the Holy Spirit, Old Testament or New.
Worship of the Holy Spirit is something kind of interesting. The the forgotten person of the Trinity, unless you're a charismatic like like me. But yeah, that's an interesting topic as well. So
praise and honor and reverence given to Jesus was a veneration, but did not violate Old Testament commandments about worship being exclusive to God.
So, this particular bullet point it seems to me, the praise, honor, and reverence given to Jesus did not violate Old Testament commandments about worship being exclusive to God. And yet, Jesus in his ministry and his life, death, and resurrection fulfilled the law in such a sense that it was totally transformed. And it's totally transformed with how it looked in the Old Testament to how Christians are called to, carry it out today. And so, yeah, so to me, I guess, again, it's not very convincing to say that this the sort of veneration that was ascribed to Jesus exactly follows in the mold of the specific command to this that we saw in the Old Testament. That line of logic is, again, not convincing to me when we see that all of the other ways that the Old Testament commands, all of these other commands were transformed into a new way. They were fulfilled in a new way through the person of Christ. And yet this one is basically static all throughout, even through the entire, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. I guess maybe Sam would say more about that and flesh that out to sort of, assuage my concerns. But, for now, that's what I am sort of interpreting that as. So there just seems like a disconnect between how this principle is, basically static throughout, and how all of the other commands are being fulfilled in much different looking ways.
I think that this has been sort of a common theme in some of the presentations this week, that we underestimate what can be given to a human being, right? We underestimate what it means to be made in the image of God. And I think we underestimate the praise, honor, and glory that can be given to Jesus as our eternal Messiah, even though, yes, he is and always has been a man. But that,
yeah, eternal Messiah, again, this is sort of a side point, but I'm wondering what Sam means in the sense of eternal, because like I say eternal Messiah, I'm like, yeah, amen, he was there at the beginning doing his Messiah thing, so to speak. If we follow the logic of I can't remember which of the Eastern Fathers is, I'm sure it's multiple, like I mentioned before, that the Christ's sacrifice was an eternal sacrifice in a sense. And so it'd be interesting to probe Sam a little more about that point.
Does not mean that it is worship or the worship that's due to God. The early Christians did not worship Jesus as God, but instead worshiped God with Jesus.
So, did not worship Jesus as God. The case of Thomas saying, "My Lord and my God," would, on its face seem to be to contradict that point. Now, Sam and I have had discussions about that particular passage that, it's a little too much detail and it's too faint in my memory anyways to go back and rehash all that. So I won't say too much about that. But instead worship God with Jesus. I think what Sam is saying here is, Jesus is our worship leader, right? In that sense. And I think, and I don't have like a whole list of chapter and verses here, but the sense that I get about Jesus in the New Testament, especially in, say, the Gospel of John or, the Epistle to the Hebrews and whatever, is it goes so much deeper than that. The way that Christ functions as a mediator, the sort of unity of purpose and identity that he possesses with the Father, I think, to boil it down, I think it doesn't capture the whole story to just say that us Christians, we worship God with Jesus. I think there's a lot more going on in that. And, again, I don't have specific verses. That's more my general sense.
Yes. The implications for Christology speak for themselves. If Jesus isn't being worshipped as God, then they did not think that he was God. And therefore, any Christology that states that Jesus is God in the sense of being the one worthy of worship is incorrect. And that leaves only a Unitarian Christology as being appropriate for understanding the early Christian worship actions in the first couple centuries. Obviously, that changed over time, but in the earliest centuries, that's what it was.
And so here's another point that I think is external to Sam's explicit argument, but it's sort of the assumption here is we had this original tradition that was lost or corrupted over time, and now we're bringing it back, right? This is the restorationist impulse, and it's a strictly Protestant and even low church Protestant impulse. Martin Luther, the Anglicans, the Lutherans still wanted a lot of continuity with church tradition, right? And I think, stepping aside from all the Christology for a second, it would be interesting to see what Sam's thoughts on the tradition, how the tradition of church history carried through to the extent that it did, because I think Sam is basically advocating for, once we get to Nicaea, the church is getting something absolutely fundamentally wrong about the nature of God himself and about the nature of Jesus himself. So that is, about as big of a problem you can have, right? If you're a Unitarian like Sam, that's the logic, I would take it. And so, my point is, in the sort of rambly here, is that what does Sam think about the continuity of tradition across time? Is that important? Is it important that the gates of hell have never prevailed against the church? Not that the gates were stormed for 1,500 years and then the restorationist movements came along and tidied it all up again. So I just bring that up because I think if you embrace a strong continuity of tradition, which doesn't bind you to the Catholic magisterium or the Orthodox hierarchy necessarily, or the Anglican, whatever. I'm just saying, if you accept the more high church argument that there is a continuity of tradition, I think Sam's position here becomes much less tenable.
All right. Implications for Unitarian Christians today. So, restorationism, restoring authentic Christianity and living it out today. Did I come up with that, or who? Where? That's Sean's motto for his podcast.
And again, I think it's worth dwelling on this a little more, that restoration is inherently violative of the principles that most Christians in traditional traditional churches have assumed and operated under for 2,000 years, if it really is continuous, right? And so, yeah, I think it's a very low church impulse. It's a very Protestant impulse. It's a very sola scriptura impulse, which is, again, a whole nother can of worms. On all of this stuff I've said in the last couple of minutes is so outside the scope of Sam's presentation that I'm not trying to just nail him on that. But I think bringing all of this stuff into the picture is important for discussing, for assessing how convincing Sam's argument is with respect to, our own presuppositions.
So I think that this conference is all about trying to have the same understanding that the early Christians had and trying to teach the same things that the early Christians had. I didn't start this presentation expecting to end up with this, but I think it's sort of an inevitable side point of the presentation, is that shouldn't we also worship the same way that the early Christians worshipped? And I'm not about to make a lot of pronouncements about what I think that is, but I think it's an important question that we should take more seriously. And I think too many times Unitarian Christians just sort of borrow and adopt the practices of sort of larger evangelical Trinitarianism from our context without much thought about what it is, why we're doing it, and what we're doing.
Well, again, and it's interesting to me that, he's making the case for the sacrifice being the center of worship, which is a staple of the traditional, lowercase o Orthodox churches, who, that entire liturgy of the Eucharist and the entire liturgy is just soaked with Trinitarianism. So I'm curious to hear what Sam's sort of alternative vision is that, you know, incorporates a sort of high view of the sacrifice in the Eucharist, but yet remains Unitarian. Yeah, that sounds like a very, you know, it sounds like an ambitious project to me.
And I think in the same way that we go back to the scriptures to understand who Jesus is and what the early Christians believed, I think we should also go back to the scriptures to understand the way the early Christians practiced. And so I won't go into any further detail, but I think that's an important side point of this presentation as well. And so with that, I will conclude and open it up for questions.
Okay, so there you go. So, I mean, if you want to hear the questions, I've always done this, long enough. So, and I'm starting to get a little tired and, you know, ready for sleep myself. So anyways, like, Sam is a fantastic communicator. He's insanely intelligent. He's way smarter than I am at this sort of stuff. He spent way more time studying it. So go check out his channel, because most of the stuff that I talked about today, he has already, sort of tried to address in one way or another on his channel. So yeah, go check it out. As for me, I don't know. I'm here. I guess this is probably going to be my first video that I'll post. I have more ideas for more things to come. So, if it catches your fancy, stick around. Yeah. So anyways, I think I will end it there. So talk to you next time.